Hello there, my RPG lovers, and welcome to another video. Dark Messiah of M&M is a first-person action RPG released in 2006 for PC and Xbox 360. I really don't know how I missed this game back in the day, probably because I was too busy with Gothic 3, Oblivion and World of Warcraft. The reception for this game was very good in general, although there is a discrepancy between the user and critique reviews. This is usually the case with a lot of games which people consider to be underrated in general.
You've got some real potential!
And indeed, I think Dark Messiah of M&M is a really underrated RPG.
You'll learn to enjoy the pain.
The first thing I wanted to do when I rolled the credits is start another playthrough. That's always a great sign, and it should tell you how I feel about this game in general. However, it's far from being perfect, and it has some notable issues with the gameplay that we're going to discuss in this video. Is it just nostalgia, or this game was actually very good and underrated? Well, let's find out.
Going to tell the nice man the truth, my love? I didn't think so.
Let's start with the technical state of the game. This game should work out of the box on modern PCs, at least it did for me. Although you will need to think about resolution, because if you try and use something like 4K, the UI will be much smaller. Full HD resolution works fine, and the UI will scale properly. I really like how the game looks in 4K on my TV, so I was ready to squint my eyes a little bit. By the way, I had a lot of crashes during my 19-hour-long playthrough. That wasn't a huge deal because I saved a lot, and the autosave feature is not that bad in this game. For the most part, unless you get stuck in between some areas which are separated with a loading screen. Yeah, it can get very ugly in those situations, you can get stuck in a dying loop, so you should save often.
Complete his existence!
I recently made a video where I talk about some old RPGs from this time periods. Dark Messiah was one of the topics in that video when I talked about the visuals and the vibe of RPGs from this particular era. Speaking of which, I think this game aged pretty good. Dark Messiah still manages to create an amazing atmosphere in pretty much all areas. Even the character models are not that bad. But the general vibe and the atmosphere in this game is just amazing. It instantly reminds me of that gaming era, it feels like a 2006 game. That might sound stupid, but you can watch that video I mentioned for more context.
It's magnificent.
Dark Messiah has a lot of different levels with a great atmosphere. I would say it's a very immersive game, and the first-person perspective is certainly one of the reasons for that. But it's not the only reason. The dark atmosphere in this game will make some levels very creepy. On the other side, some levels can make the game feel very goofy because of the silly physics that we're going to talk about soon. It can be hard to take the game seriously sometimes, but you shouldn't take the game seriously because it's just a game. Nerds.
Nerd!
The beginning of the story in Dark Messiah is pretty interesting. You play as a guy called Saret, who is an apprentice of the wizard Fenrig. The game throws you straight in the tutorial section, where you get to learn all the basic gameplay mechanics. Dark Messiah is very heavy on the gameplay, and we're going to talk about all major gameplay features, but I want to talk a little bit about the story first. Saret spends years of studying the arts of magic and physical training with Fenrig, and he's finally ready to start his trial. He needs to retrieve a special crystal with the help of another wizard called Menelag. Menelag and Fenrig have a mutual interest for a special artifact called Skull of Shadows. The story quickly turns into a search for the Skull of Shadows, and along the way, you're going to meet a couple of more important characters. A spirit called Xena will be your guide by entering your mind, basically. Then you get to meet Liana, a young niece of Menelag. You're going to interact with Liana a lot throughout the whole game while being guided by Xena. There is quite a bit of dialogue in this game, but it usually never gets in the way of the gameplay.
Don't believe any of it, dear.
Xena is constantly yapping some evil bullshit and she's always horny. Like, really horny.
I'm a friend, an ally, and I could do even more.
She is also hell-bent on killing Liana, and she's desperately trying to convince you to kill her in the late game. The great thing about this is the choices you can make, which will affect the ending of the game. That was hands down my most favorite part about the story, because even if you don't want to kill Liana, you'll be tempted sometimes. She can be very annoying, but the good thing about it, you can kill her or just leave her to die in the spider's nest.
Don't let them steal my soul!
Xena becomes extremely annoying with her dialogue lines as well, so I decided to side with Liana at the end.
So forceful.
These two characters are basically the angel and the devil on your shoulders. I was expecting a plot twist or two at least, and some more character development, but that never happened. Xena and Liana are very one-dimensional characters, and it's easy to predict what's going to happen in the story.
Master, I'll do anything you ask. I'll be yours forever.
As the name of the game suggests, you are the Dark Messiah, which you find out somewhere in the middle of the story. I mean, it's not even a spoiler, it's right there in the title. You can choose to resist the temptations and cure yourself or just let it happen. Listen, by the end of the game, I kinda forgot how Xena looks. I mean, she promised a couple of, interesting things.
There's nowhere to go but down from here.
Anyway, where was I? Oh yeah, I just didn't care about any of these characters, to be honest. It's not like they're poorly written, they're just one-dimensional and boring. Like I said, the whole story is very predictable. On the other side, it's good enough to keep you going. There are 4 different ending cutscenes with some minor differences.
Curse you and Isabel for failing me!
So what about the gameplay? Well, I'm glad you asked. Dark Messiah is developed with the Source engine, which was eager to show its brand new physics features. Kicking enemies in this game is not only an optional mechanic, it's basically essential in combat. You can kick people off cliffs, throw various objects on enemies, impale them on walls, and so on. This wouldn't be possible without the amazing physics system. The physics in this game are still very impressive, even after almost 20 years. The attention to detail is just amazing. For example, you can behead zombies with a headshot, and the head of that zombie can then hit the zombie behind it. The best thing about it can actually stagger the enemy, giving you the chance to finish them off easily. You can pick up a lot of random objects on the map and throw it on enemies, which can give you all sorts of advantages in fights or create some silly moments.
Did I hear something?
Hitting enemies with weapons is no different, their body will behave in a realistic manner and there's always a chance for something silly to happen. Combined with a very satisfying mutilation system, it makes the melee combat very enjoyable in moment-to-moment gameplay. Although a lot of the kill mechanics seem very random and situational, and the balancing is all over the place. I beat the whole game and I'm still not sure what triggers the kill animations in this game. Is it the positioning, the health left on the enemy, the damage of your weapon, or all of that combined? Whatever the case might be, I think the kill moves are extremely satisfying. But how do you even balance such combat system? Well, you do and you don't. The game is hyper focused on using the environment to kill your enemies. Look, I love the physics in this game and kicking people around is fun from the beginning to the very end. However, that pretty much forces the combat system to take a back seat. It's not like you can't kill all enemies by just using combat melee mechanics, bows and magic. Actually, I'm not that sure about magic because I didn't use it that much. But it's way harder to kill enemies without constantly needing to use the environment, up to the point where the gameplay can feel very cheesy. You can tell that the game doesn't want you to just swing your weapons or use the bow and magic to kill enemies. It practically begs you to use the environment to your advantage. It's easily the most optimal way of dispatching enemies on each and every level, except the boss fights, but that's another topic. I was going for a full melee build mixed with archery. You can't see the health on enemies, which only makes the combat even more confusing. I mean, you can hit some enemies up to 20 times with your sword and they would still be alive.
Prepare yourself.
Then you kill the same enemy type with less than 2 hits. Okay. To be fair, the weapon damage is a huge thing in this game. Later in the game you'll find some elemental weapons which are effective against certain enemy types. So if you hit the enemy that's weak to fire with fire-based weapon, you'll kill them much easier. For example, the Dragonborn bow has a strong damage against undead, and you'll kill zombies and undead priests with a couple of arrows max. Knowing which element will deal a lot of damage to which enemy types helps a lot. I mean, it's an RPG at the end of the day, so it makes sense. Or you can just position yourself near the cliff or the wall with the spikes and just kill everyone with a swift kick to the face. I'm pretty sure I died a lot more in this game than in Elden Ring, because I was trying to kill everything with melee weapons. I learned this the hard way while trying to play the game on hard difficulty in the beginning. I got my ass handed to me multiple times in one of the beginning levels. This was the moment when I realized how Arcane expects you to play this game. But here's my biggest problem with the combats. Getting hit in this game can feel extremely frustrating because sometimes it just doesn't make any sense. The animations for weapon swings on enemies and the hit detection are not synchronized properly, for some attacks at least. Enemies will land hits on you much earlier than you can see the animation, or sometimes you won't even get to see it. Even when everything works as intended, you need to react a bit earlier to all hits. I mean, you don't need to, you can just hold the block button, but parrying enemy hits gives you a slight advantage in melee fights. That's because it staggers them for a second, giving you the chance to deal serious damage to them or even finish them off. I really like parrying in games, so I try to use it a lot in Dark Messiah, but I don't recommend it. A lot of attacks are just pure bullshit and you won't even see them coming, so just holding the block button is much easier and more effective. This game really lacks proper telegraphed attacks, but it's not the end of the world. Despite these issues, the combat manages to be very fun. I love the sprinting attack, which is basically 2 attacks at once, but you need to aim it properly. And just in general, I think your attacks have a decent amount of impacts. It kinda feels like a much better version of Oblivion's combat, which is honestly not that hard to do. I mean, I love Oblivion, but melee weapons in that game felt like you're swinging boiled spaghetti. It was completely weightless. Dark Messiah's combat can also feel weightless in some situations, like the one I mentioned before, where you can hit the enemy countless times with little to no effects. The game offers you a couple of different melee play styles. You can use a sword and a shield, daggers, which have very fast attacks, and staves, which also have a unique attack animations. For my second playthrough, I'm thinking I'm going to play with daggers and maybe focus on stealth a bit more. Yeah, you can also be stealthy if you wish, but I prefer Unga Bunga playstyles in my RPGs, especially for the first playthrough. Using bows feels great, and I love how you can find different elemental bows and just weapons in general. I didn't use a lot of magic, but it seems very good, if not even OP. One essential spell that you need to use is the spell which allows you to see in the dark. This game has some extremely dark levels, and it can be very creepy at times. Zombies can creep up on you in a very effective way, which made me really paranoid while I was exploring these dungeons. Speaking of making my skin crawl, these motherfuckers give me the creeps, regardless of the level. That's because they have a distinctive sound effect, which you can hear even before you see them. And even though they're pretty weak, they attack in numbers. Like I said before, the game truly does a great job with the atmosphere in general, and this is a huge plus in my book. Dark Messiah has a very decent amount of different enemy types, but they all fight very similar. Elite guards gave me a lot of troubles later in the game, but no enemy is immune to the Spartan kick. Necromancers can be very annoying in the late game if you don't have this bow that will kill them in a couple of hits. Boss fights are okay, although most of them are very gimmicky. I mean, it's to be expected in a game from 2006. The presentation makes these fights more enjoyable than they actually are from the gameplay side of things. They were still fun and a great way to break the monotony a little bit. To sum up the combat, I wish they focused a bit more on polishing the actual combat mechanics, but it's far from being bad. It can certainly get very repetitive after a longer play session, but a lot of games have this problem. You can make the game much harder for yourself if you're not playing as Arcane Studios intended. Even on normal difficulty, you'll get your ass kicked if you don't exploit the environments. Yeah, I said exploit because sometimes it really feels like that. Even so, the gameplay in Dark Messiah is very fun in general. Dark Messiah has solid RPG features like some choices and different endings, as well as the option to play as a mage, rogue or a warrior. When you gain enough experience and level up, you get some skill points that you can invest in 3 different skill trees. Stronger skills require a lot more points, so it's smart to save up the skill points so you can get something stronger than just spending them for the sake of it. Most items in the game will require you to have specific skills. I think the game did a good job by making me feel excited to finally use some stronger weapons, like this sword for example. You can loot armors, weapons, ammo, potions and miscellaneous items. I like how the lightning shield has to be recharged in order to stun the enemy by blocking again. And most weapons with strong elemental attacks work the same. I think it's a good system. Although it could have been much better if they focused on polishing the combat, like I said before. Somewhere in the middle of the game, you gain the ability to turn into a demon. It makes sense from the story perspective, but gameplay wise, this was a total mess. Fighting in this form just doesn't feel good, it's clumsy, and it turns up the jankiness of the game up to 11. I just ignore this ability because it's trash. It can be cool in the beginning, just because of the running speed, but that's about it. You get the option to cleanse yourself from the curse later in the game, and if you do, you'll get some unique items as well. At the expense of losing the demon ability and the horny succubus Xena.
Try to avoid doing that again, will you, my sweet?
Don't worry though, there are plenty of succubus on OnlyFans these days. Even though the game is mostly linear, there are many different hidden areas to find. The level design is usually very good, although sometimes a bit confusing since you need to do some backtracking. And sometimes you'll get stuck with no clear path for progressing further. I actually think those segments are interesting because it makes you think for a moment. And when you figure it out, you always have that moment of, oh, I was so stupid, of course. Those kinds of moments usually indicate good level design, if you ask me. The levels in Dark Messiah are pretty linear, but you're not running in a straight line all the time. The verticality of these levels is pretty good, and you need to use the rope bow quite a bit, and I think it's very fun. The rope bow can be used on wooden areas, and you can also grab chains as well. I think the variety of levels is pretty good, and they remain interesting throughout the whole game. There are optional quests to do, which sometimes affect the actual story. You can choose to ignore them if you wish, but even that can affect the main story. That being said, I think the consequences are not that impactful. All you get is a slightly different cutscene at the end, so it's not exactly very satisfying. Even so, I still prefer to have something like this than just having a very linear outcome of the story. Dark Messiah of Might and Magic is a game that I highly recommend playing regardless of the year. So to answer my own question from the beginning, no, it's not just nostalgia.
You've got some real potential!
This is still a very good game in general that every fan of action RPGs should try out. It's a very unique action RPG and we haven't seen anything similar to it in a long time.
It's magnificent.
There is an upcoming RPG called Alka Heist. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right, but it seems to be inspired by Dark Messiah, so I'll keep my eye on that one. Even though Dark Messiah has some problems with the gameplay, they are far from being game-breaking. I'm really happy that I finally got to beat this game, and I'm looking forward to my second playthrough in the near future.
Don't believe any of it, dear.
Anyway, tell me your opinion about Dark Messiah in the comments below. Did you play it before, and did you like it or not? Be sure to subscribe if you enjoyed the video. You can also support me by becoming a YouTube member or a Patreon. I also have some cool t-shirts and hoodies in the theme of the channel, so check that out as well. Huge thanks to all of my current supporters, and I'll see you in the next one.